Born in 270, Nicholas of Myra grew up in an elite, high-class, wealthy religious home. His parents died in an epidemic while Nicholas was still very young, and following this tragedy, he went to live with his uncle, who was also a pastor. As an adult, Nicholas followed in his uncle's footsteps and also went into the ministry. He was known as a confident man who was focused on defending the faith and the people in his church. This drive to protect his church family could have come from his longing to have a family while he was still growing up. His great concern for the welfare of his church earned him respect from many other pastors in the area. One story actually has him throwing bags of gold into a man's house on 3 consecutive nights. The owner of the home had no money for his daughter's dowries, and Nicholas knew they would end up as prostitutes because of their situation. He saw the need, and he knew he could meet it. He was also known for putting coins in people's shoes. If they left him out, he would fill them. Do these stories sound familiar? Nicholas, or as some call him, Saint Nick. He didn't choose poverty like Francis of Assisi or Rich Mullins, but he didn't live like he could have either. Instead, he lived a life of generosity. He was always looking for ways to give, and the story of his giving became legendary.
Well, we are in this third week, and I was reminded of a story of a couple of boys who were sitting in the back seat of their parents' car. They were just on their way back from a family birthday party for the younger boy, and as a lot of family birthday parties go, in his birthday card he had received a bunch of cash, and he was all excited about the first time he'd ever had money before, just 4 or 5 years old, and he was talking about what he was going to spend his money on. Well, his older brother, who was a year and a half or 2 years older than him, he said, you know, Jacob, you should really give your money to charity. And the kid said, no, Ben, I'm not going to give my money to charity. He said, Jacob, you should consider giving your money to charity, because when you give your money to charity, it's like giving to God. He said, no, Ben, I'm not going to give my money to charity. He said, Jacob, just at least think about it. Consider giving your money to charity. He said, no, Ben, Charity is not giving my money, and I don't even know who she is. Well, I know that this is about our third week into this giving series. And in this third week, some of you might be feeling like you're going to boot camp. You are going to tough it out. And you're thinking, man, well, we get one more week after this week, and we're going to be all done, and then we can get on to talking about the holidays. And maybe you're feeling a little bit woozy after 2 weeks of this and hearing all about giving, and it's been a bit of a challenge. In fact, at times I'm wondering if there's been a cabin drop in pressure and there's oxygen masks are going to pop out of the ceilings for us to get rejuvenated here. But we are going to get through this, and this is an important series for us to get through. It's important. Some of you might be thinking, why 4 weeks of this? I mean, 4 weeks, that's an awful lot. You know, I can see he's got to preach on money once in a while, but 4 weeks in a row. Well, the reason is I'm actually being kind. Because if we were going to do an entire theology of generosity and talk all about what the Bible says about giving, this would be the longest series I've ever done. And I spent about 2.5 years on Romans about 10 years ago. This would be longer than that. The Bible says so much about it. So we're just condensing it down into about 4 weeks. And I realize that we are sensitive about this subject. And there's a number of reasons why we may be sensitive. Some of them may be good reasons. For some, it can be because we want to make sure that we're not being manipulated. We want to make sure that we're not being coerced into doing something that wouldn't be right. Or we also want to make sure that we're not being taken advantage of. But other reasons may not be so good. And maybe because we have that bag mentality that we talked about last week, carrying around that bag with us. And so one of the top reasons you know that you need preaching along these lines is if you don't want to hear it. Because all of us as Christians, we ought to place ourselves into positions of a bit of discomfort. Comfort is the enemy of growth. And all of us ought to open ourselves up to being challenged. And so if these are things that we don't want to hear about, well, that's a pretty good indicator that this is exactly what we need to hear. Now, there are some in our church that are struggling financially. And you might be in that situation. In recent days, because of the economic downturn about 4 years ago and all that has taken place, we've got people that have their own businesses where there's just not a lot going on out there and struggling in their own businesses. Others who have lost their jobs because companies have had to lay off a lot of workers, again, because there's just not a lot going on out there. And so you might be struggling, and it may have been a temporary thing. Others we have here, you've been struggling your whole life. I mean, it's been financial problems for as long as you can remember. It's always been hand to mouth, and it's always been a struggle for you. And I would say to both of you groups, whether it's temporary or this is early, or if you're doing really well financially and you're feeling pretty good about where things are at, for everybody, I want to put in a plug for Financial Peace University. As we're doing this series, I mean, FPU is good for every one of us. Particularly, if you're married, as a couple, I would say do this together. The three big things that couples fight about is money, sex, and kids. And FPU covers that money thing very well. And you get a couple that they take this together and you can be on the same page with putting your budget together and how you're spending things. That'll be huge for your marriage. And so we're going to be offering it again in January. In fact, Robert Prince is going to be out in the lobby between the services. He's got a table that's set up, and we want to encourage people to sign up for that. It's so well worth it. If you've not taken it, I'd encourage you to take it. If you're a young person, this is a great time for you to get these principles settled. And so this would be good for you to be able to take this now as well. So last week, we kicked this whole series off. This series really is about going from gratitude to giving, right? From Thanksgiving to Christmas, is bridging that gap. And 2 weeks ago, we started the series by talking about gratitude. And you remember the theme of that was that gratitude and giving are inextricably linked. That if you are grateful, you will be generous. And if you're not generous, that's an indicator that you're not really grateful. You might think that you are, but if you're not generous, it's an indicator that gratitude is not motivating you. But if you're in that situation, you realize, man, I guess I'm not really that grateful. Well, one of the best ways to change your heart is to become generous no matter how you feel. And the very act of giving does something about attacking that greed within our hearts that changes the way we look at our material possessions. And by giving, we wind up being able to appreciate and enjoy even what we already have. And so gratitude and generosity are inextricably linked. Now, last week, we talked about giving being a privilege. We talked about the Macedonians and how they saw it as a privilege. They begged Paul to take their gifts because they didn't want to be left out in this. It was a privilege to be able to give. And if you remember the principles that we gained from that, it was, first of all, that our giving, our generosity transcends circumstances. That generosity has nothing to do with circumstances. You will not become more generous as you gain more favorable circumstances. People who are generous when they're poor are more likely to be generous when they're wealthy. And in fact, we find that the wealthier a person becomes, the less generous they tend to be percentage-wise. And so one of the other principles we talked about is how we need to challenge ourselves. We need to exercise generosity within ourselves. Just like everything else in life, we have to challenge ourselves to grow in this area. Because by becoming uncomfortable, by putting ourselves in that position of being challenged, we grow, and then the end result is it's even a change in mindset. And that's where we talked about the bag mindset and the basket mindset and how God intends us to be going through life with a basket mentality, that all that He has given to us, He's given to us to use not only for our own enjoyment, though that's included, but also for the blessing of others and to aid with His work. Well, I've learned some things in this series myself. And you have to remember that you might be thinking, boy, I've been sitting through this 45 minutes a week now for 2 weeks, and I got another 2 weeks more of this. But remember, I've been doing this for over a month as I began to prepare for this series, and I'm thinking about this stuff all week long. And if this is speaking to you at all, it's speaking all the more to me. If there's one thing that I have learned in this series thus far, it is I need to be generous more than the recipients of my gifts need my gifts. Well, we know the need is out there, and we do talk about the need, but that's not the big deal. The bigger deal is the need for us, for our hearts to become generous, and for us to be changed. And so my need to be generous is greater than the need that the recipients have of my gifts. As I said last week, we're not doing this series to raise dollars. We're doing this series to raise disciples. Because when it comes to our material possessions and our generosity with that which we have, I don't think there is a greater indicator of our spiritual growth or a greater motivator of our spiritual growth when we can turn everything over to God, even that which we so tangibly have within our possession. And so I'm not preaching this series to grow the resources of our church. I'm preaching this series to grow the Christians of our church. Now, last week we looked primarily at the first 15 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and so we're going to go into 2 Corinthians chapter 8 again, starting in verse 16. We're going to look through the end of that chapter and then borrow from chapter 9 as well, as we're looking at principles for this week, which is it's about trust. That's what this week is, that giving or generosity, being generous, it is all about trust. And we're going to look at three different aspects of our understanding of that word trust and what that does for our practice of giving. And so it's on page 968 if you're using those hardcover Bibles. If you want to pull your Bibles out right now, let's take a look at this. And so beginning in verse 16 of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he starts off with, remember that word charis we discussed the first week? Those bookend verses, the chapter 8 verse 1, chapter 9 verse 15, they have their bookend verses with the theme of the word charis, which is most often translated grace. And that word means to freely give and to receive with appreciation. And he starts off with that in this verse 16. He says, "But thanks be to God." That's that word charis there, the word thanks. "Thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you." Now, Titus, you're familiar with Titus. We have a book in the Bible, in fact, called Titus. It was Paul's letter to Titus. Paul mentored Titus. He was a fairly young believer, now establishing himself as a Christian leader. He was a young pastor, in fact, for a time pastored. And we believe at this time, in fact, he was returning back to Corinth as a leader in the church in Corinth. Later on, he would become a pastor in the island of Crete. And so he was a young Christian leader that Paul was mentoring. And the Corinthians trusted Titus. Titus was actually used by Paul in going back to Corinth. If you're familiar with the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul had helped establish the church in Corinth, and at one time they had a lot of trust in Corinth, but then these false prophets came along, false teachers came along, and they just attacked Paul and accused him of all kinds of things, and so the people in Corinth started to lose faith in Paul. He had lost credibility in their minds, and that probably is one of the reasons why the gifts that he had encouraged them to give for the Jerusalem brothers, why that had started to wane, which we talked about last week. Probably had something to do with their loss of faith in Paul. Then in 1 Corinthians, he wrote that book to restore his own credibility as well as sending Titus to the Corinthians. And the Corinthians paid attention to what Titus had to say. We find in the beginning part of 2 Corinthians that trust in Paul was restored, and Titus was a big part of that. So he's talking about Titus here, who had just for a short time had gone to Paul to report to Paul what was going on in Corinth. Paul was sending Titus back, and he was probably bearing this letter with him. It says in verse 17, he says, "For he not only accepted our appeal," that was the appeal for the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem that were hurting. He said, "but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel." Now this guy who is famous, we don't know who this is. It was some kind of a preacher in the early church that was well known, and evidently was quite an orator. People respected him. Some have speculated that it might be Apollos, the way this is how Apollos was described, but we have no idea who this is. But this guy was going with Titus, somebody that was well respected. And he goes on in verse 19. He says, "And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace," this charis again, "that is being ministered by us." So I think it'd be preferable to actually say this act of giving being ministered by us, "for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill." So he's talking about the group of people that would be going to Corinth, that would be receiving the gifts that the Corinthians had already started collecting and then stopped, and he was encouraging them to restart their collecting of these gifts. This was the group that was going to be receiving these gifts and then taking these gifts to Jerusalem. Okay, so he goes on in verse 20. He says, "We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us." Now, understand what Paul is saying is that we want you to have faith in the fact that the dollars that you are giving, of course it wasn't dollars, but the money that you are giving, that this is going to be used for its intended purposes. You don't have to trust one individual to carry this money and be fearful that they're going to take this money for themselves, for their own personal gain. That's not what this is about. You can trust these people. They're well respected, and it's a group of them, so nobody can point a finger at any one of us and say, "You're stealing these funds," or "This is, you're not really using them for what you say they're being raised for." And you know what? This helps us to understand that it is good for us to be thoughtful in our giving. We shouldn't just give based on emotion or see some kind of a heart-wrenching commercial or watch some guy on TV make all kinds of crazy promises and then decide to follow through on that and on a spur of the moment just give. Now, I think our heart should be involved in our giving and emotions should be involved, but our giving should be thoughtful. And it's right for us to check out the recipients of those gifts. Is this an organization that is credible? Can we trust this organization to do good with these dollars? And I have no doubt whatsoever. I believe with all my heart that when we give to the local church, and if it's a church that we can believe in, and you shouldn't be here if this church is not a church that you can believe in, but the local church is God's plan for promoting the gospel throughout the world. And I believe that the way God had intended the local church to be set up, there's the right kind of accountability, and it's the right mission. Our primary mission, while we do a lot in feeding the poor, and we do all kinds of community outreach things, and we believe in those things, but our primary mission is God's mission, and that is getting the gospel out, rescuing people's eternal destiny, not simply the temporary condition that they're in currently. And so that's the mission that we ought to believe in. And so he says it's okay to check out your recipients. Make sure that you're giving to the right people. And he's making a case for this. He's saying, you know what, you can trust us. This is a group of us. We're holding each other accountable, and the money is going to be delivered. He goes on and he says, verse 21, for we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. That probably was the brother who was famous that he spoke of earlier. Then he says in verse 23, as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit, and as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ, so give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. And so what we have Paul beginning this whole section is he is giving us this whole principle of giving as a trust. Now, it was a very practical principle here when he was saying, we understand that as you have taken these collections together and you give these gifts to us, what we will have in our possession, what we will carry with us to Jerusalem, doesn't really belong to us. That you have collected this money, you're giving it to us to now deliver it to the churches in Macedonia, or to the churches in the Jerusalem area, primarily the Jerusalem church. And so we understand that this that is put in our possession is a trust. You know, it's actually a Bible principle in regards to all of our possessions. That everything that we have, it all belongs to God. None of us are going to be able to take it with us. We're going to leave it behind to somebody, and whoever we leave it behind to, it doesn't belong to them either. Everything that we receive, it all comes from God, and it all belongs to God. In fact, Jesus told a couple of parables about this. One in particular was one of his favorite parables. We find it both in Matthew 25 and Luke chapter 12. Or Luke 19, and where he talked about a landowner who was traveling to a foreign country, and as he traveled, he left behind his money with 3 different stewards, we call them. Stewards are those that have been given a trust. Somebody is trusting them to do the right thing with what they've been given. And that's what we are. We are stewards of all that God has given to us. And he said that of these 3, 2 of them were faithful and one of them was not faithful because the money wasn't theirs in the first place and they were obligated to use this money according to the landowner. The whole point that Jesus was making with that parable was that everything that we have actually belongs to God, and we are obligated to God and responsible to Him to use this, our material possessions, in a way that would be honoring and pleasing to Him. Now there's another great parable that Jesus gave, that one of his most famous parables, the Good Samaritan, found in Luke chapter 10. And here he actually lays out for us the 3 different kinds of stewards, 3 main characters and their attitudes towards material possessions, and he contrasts them in the story of the Good Samaritan. Now the main character of the story, first of all, you remember the story, right? The main character of the story wasn't the thief. Wasn't the guy that was stolen from, the traveler. He's just ancillary. This guy's he's traveling along, going from one place to another, and these thieves came along, and what do? They beat him up, they steal everything that he's got, and they lay him to die in the ditch. And so we first of all have these thieves that come along. Those are the first group of stewards, what we would call takers. And the takers, they view everything in this world as for their own taking. They just have to figure out a clever way of being able to get it in their possession. Now, they may break the law in doing so, and some may not break the law in doing so, but it's more of a mindset than anything else. They are takers, and they're just always looking for ways to be able to get for themselves what is out there. That's who they are, and it's of their very nature. We see this in the news all the time. There's recently, there are financial managers that are in prison because of their Ponzi schemes, and their whole goal, while they were responsible for managing the owners of their funds, managing their money, instead what they did is they took it for themselves. Well, there was a sports agent a few years ago. I remember this taking place. I remember the guy's nickname was Tank. And Black was his last name, but he was an agent for a number of NFL, actually professional baseball, basketball as well. I remember the story because he managed a few of the Green Bay Packers, a few of them. He also managed some of the Bears' money. And he wound up in prison because he stole millions from these players, that he was their agent. He was supposed to be managing their money, but he stole from them. These are takers. He was supposed to be a steward, but he was a taker. And takers don't necessarily have to break the law. It's more of a mindset than anything else. They see the world as there for them, and they just have to figure out a way to get it. But the second group that we have, as we know in that story of the Good Samaritan, this guy that had been beaten by these thieves and left for dead, well then two religious come along, a priest and a Levite. And they see the guy there in the ditch, and they see that he needs help, but they are fearful of somebody else coming along and the same thieves stealing from them. So rather than helping this guy out, they actually walked on the other side of the road and tried to pretend that he wasn't there. We call this group the keepers. That while they also had been given the resources to help this guy, but they were going to hold on to it themselves because they were afraid if they did help them, they would lose what they would have. And we know there's a whole world of keepers out there as well. They may not be breaking the law in order to take from others, but their mindset is what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. The takers say, what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. The keepers say, what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. They're the ones with the bag mentality. That everything that I have in life, I'm putting in this bag, and I've got to protect this, and people are out to get me, and I want to make sure that nobody gets what I've got. They're the keepers. But you know, from God's perspective, we have an indication in Scripture that He doesn't see a lot of difference. In fact, there's a passage in Malachi chapter 3. I'm talking about the woozy time, the sensitive time. If there's ever a time when you're going to get angry with me, it's when we start talking about this stuff here. But there's a passage in Malachi 3, and you know what the prophet Malachi says? He says, you've been holding back giving to God, holding back your tithes, and you know what you are? You are thieves. You are thieves. You are robbing God. And they said, how are we robbing God? And he says, in your tithes and offerings. And see, the biblical principle is this, that God not only gives to us to provide for our needs, but He also gives to us a portion that He expects for us to pass on for His work and to be a blessing to others. And when we keep that for ourselves, it is the same as stealing from God. That's what the prophet Malachi said. And we also have illustrations of this. There's a mailman in Des Plaines quite a few years ago now. He had been entrusted with people's mail while it was in his possession. It wasn't his. But because he was getting lazy on snowy days and rainy days, he started filling up his garage with mail that he didn't want to deliver. Instead of delivering it, he was stashing it in his garage. You wind up going to jail for this. What if at Christmas time like this, you delivered a package, you want a package to be delivered to one of your nieces or nephews, and so you sent it via UPS, and the UPS driver kind of gets a hold of it and starts shaking and thinking, man, there might be something good in here. And so he keeps it for himself, but he says, hey, it was mine, it was in my possession. God says, just because it's in your possession doesn't mean it's yours to keep. I have given to you a portion of what I intend for you to pass on for the benefit of my work and for the blessing of other people. And if you keep it, it's the same as stealing. And so we've got takers, we've got keepers, but the third group, of course, in this story, the Good Samaritan, are the givers. And that was the Good Samaritan who used of his own resources, his own energy, his own time, put himself at risk in order to help this guy who was in the ditch. And after he'd even started nursing him back to health, feeding him, and giving him the necessities of life, then he went ahead and paid the innkeeper out of his own money and said, I've got to leave for a time. Would you use this money now to care for him until I can return? This was the giver. And Jesus told that story because that's his expectation of his followers, of all of us to follow his example of giving. He gave his life for us. He desires for us to do the same for one another. All right, so those are the three kinds of stewards. Everything that we have is a trust from God. That's that first aspect of trust. But we have another aspect of trust, and that is it takes trust to give to God. We call this a trust in God. Now, we particularly see this in chapter 9. If you go down to chapter 9, you look at verse 6 and the following verses, we see this, but even in greater detail, we see this when he was writing to the Macedonians. Remember the Macedonians who were the examples he was lifting up for the Corinthians? Look what he's writing to the Macedonians in Philippians 4, verse 19. Now, the Philippians, this would probably be the main church there in Macedonia. They were givers to this cause. In fact, they not only gave to this cause, but they also gave to take care of Paul's needs as Paul was ministering. And Paul talked about that in verses 17 and 18. He was commending them. He says, I wasn't even seeking a gift from you for my own needs, but because of your love for me and wanting for me to be able to minister on your behalf and others' behalf, you have been faithful in giving to me, and I want to thank you for it. And then he says this. He says, my God will supply all your needs. That's the promise that God gives. The question is, are we going to believe that? Do we trust God that if we give what is in our possession for the benefit of other people and for His work, do we trust God then to take care of our needs? And the sad thing is it actually gets harder the more that we have. That's the sad thing. So that's the real question. Am I willing to trust God with what is left over? And I fear that for too many of us, we would rather keep 100% of what we receive for ourselves than the tithe and believe that God's blessing will be on the 90%. I learned a long time ago, I'm so much better off by going ahead and giving God that tithe, and God's blessing is on the 90%. I'm so better off, even financially, with His blessing on that 90% than I am in trying to hold on to the 100% and not receive His blessing. Now, going back to that Malachi passage, that's exactly what Malachi was talking about. And again, I know that this is one of those places where we start saying, yeah, but Malachi is Old Testament. That's in the Old Testament. And that's a good catch. I agree with you. That's in the Old Testament. And the law was in effect, and the tithe was a part of the law. It was required that the Israelites, by law, were supposed to give a tenth of their income. Actually, they had to give more than that because they had 2 annual tithes. And then they had a tithe every 3rd year, and so most calculate the tithe required by the Israelites as to be closer to 23%, to 23, 24% than the 10%. But in reality, the tithe was practiced by God's people before the law was ever given. The law simply regulated what God's people were already practicing. The principle of the tithe was that they gave God the top 10% as an expression of their commitment to God, that He was first place in their lives, and His ownership over the rest of all that they had. That was the principle of the tithe. When the law came, the law simply regulated that principle that was already being practiced. When we get into the New Testament, Jesus actually endorsed the tithe. People say, well, it's not in the New Testament. Well, it is. Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, and He said, you guys have been doing these things, including the tithe. He says, you've been paying your tithe, and you've been doing this and this, but you have been forgetting about the matters of the heart. And then He goes on, and He says, now, the former things you ought to have done, without leaving the latter things undone. In other words, he was not criticizing the Pharisees for practicing the tithe. In fact, He says that was a good thing that you were doing. And what do we do with what is written in the Old Testament? We simply say we're just going to write all that off, all those 39 books that they really aren't for us anyway? Well, of course not. The principles of the Old Testament are here for our own benefit. And while we do not practice the tithe in the same way, following the ceremonial regulations that the Israelites practiced, or view it in a legalistic sense that, you know what, I'm going to be condemned if I do not practice the tithe, it is a principle that is beneficial for us. And here's something I think a good way to remember this. The tithe as law has gone away. It's not a law for us as Christians. The tithe as law has gone away, but the tithe as principle is here to stay. The tithe as law has gone away. The tithe as principle is here to stay. So this whole tithe trust then, trusting God with the tithe. What actually takes place with this tithe trust? I think about it this way. I went to, back when my kids were little, so this goes back quite a long ways. Whenever Linda would be at some kind of a church function or gone for the evening, I would treat the kids. And it was as much a treat for me as it was for the kids. It was a treat for me that I wouldn't have to cook for the kids, but it was a treat for them that they wouldn't have to eat my cooking. And so we didn't very often, we very rarely ever went out as a family when our kids were little. It cost too much. But once in a while, we'd do this treat. And of course, when we did go out, it would have to be cheap, so I would take them to McDonald's. And we'd go to McDonald's, and Brock was about 3 years old or so he would want a Happy Meal and get that little toy for boys and play with that while he's eating. And then Erica, she was about 7, but she would, she was pretty little, and she would just still get a Happy Meal as well and get whatever doll came in that because she loved those dolls. And Junior, he was about 11 or so he would usually order a Quarter Pounder and a Big Mac and supersize one of those meals. And he'd have this great big thing full of fries. And of course, my kids, they'd both have fries in their Happy Meals. And so when it's time for me to order, I'm trying to hold the cost down. And so I'd get my sandwich and then a glass of water, because that's really where they make their money. And I'm thinking, man, I really want fries. But I'm looking down, they've got fries and 2 Happy Meals. And there's Junior's supersized fries there. I'm thinking, I'm just going to have some of their fries. And so I'll order the sandwich and get my water. And by this time, they're already over at the table. I go over and sit down at the table with them. And we pray, and then I say, kids, I didn't get any fries, but I'm going to have a few of yours. And so I reach out and I start taking some of their fries, and what do you think their reaction is going to be? Daddy, those are my fries. No, Daddy, why don't you get your own fries? Those are our fries. And you know what I would say? I would say, now, listen, children, I am your father. I have provided for you these fries. Where did these fries come from? From the goodness of my heart. And I could make sure that you never eat another fry again until you are 18. Or I could open up the drive-through windows of McDonald's and give you all the fries you will ever want. So, do you think I could have a few of your fries? I, the Lord of your fries. And what do you think the kids would say then? Well, they would give me a couple of their fries. You see, here's the problem that we have, is we forget that God is the one who has given us everything. And out of love for Him, what is He asking for us? He's asking for us to communicate that in a tangible way by saying, God, you are first place in my life. You do own everything that I have. I want to communicate off the top of what I receive. I am going to give you just a tenth. And thank you that it's only a tenth. It's just a tithe. And you know what God says? We look at that Malachi chapter 3 passage. He says, test me. Let me prove myself. Test me and see if I will not open up the windows of heaven and give you so much blessing that you will not be able to receive it all. He goes on and he says, and I will rebuke the devourer. What would the devourer be? He said, I will rebuke the devourer, that which is holding back you from receiving your full harvest in the field and what's causing the fruit to die on the vine. He says, see if I will not rebuke the devourer, that which is taking away when you're saying, I don't know where the money is going. He says, you be faithful to me with the right heart attitude and test me and let me prove myself to you to show you that I will take care of you. The question is, will we trust Him? What does the tithe trust do? This accomplishes just a couple things. Let me just go through this quickly. First of all, it provides for God's work. When we practice tithing, it gives us the wonderful privilege to be able to participate with God in His work. And what an incredible thing that is. Because God doesn't need our money. The Bible says He owns a cattle on a thousand hills. He doesn't need anything from us. But He wants us the joy of being able to participate in doing His great work. And that is a huge privilege. It's like the time a guy came to me, it was about this time of the year, several years ago, and he brought up a family's name, and he said, I know they're hurting right now. So-and-so's not been working for a while. I know he's really looking hard, and I know they're really struggling. And he said, I don't want to go up to him. I think he'd be embarrassed if I came to him and gave him some money. So would you give him this for me? And he actually handed me a wad of bills, and on the outside, all I could see was a $100 bill on the outside, but there was more on the inside. And I wasn't even sure how much it was. And I said, yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And so I walked over to this guy and kind of took him aside and said, can I talk to you just for a second? And I said, I want you to take this. It's not even from me. This is from somebody else, but just see this as being a gift from God. And this is important for you guys this time of year. And I had him this money, and he was just like dumbstruck. And I walked away. I was feeling 10 feet tall. I was feeling so good about myself. What did I do? I just gave to this man something that somebody else had given me to give to him. There's something about participating in God's work, even though it all belongs to Him. The fact that we have a privilege to give back to Him that which already belongs to Him. We are able to participate in His work. And that's why He says He wants us to do this willingly. Not under compulsion, as though this is a legal requirement under the law. But this is a principle where we get to participate in His work. We're able to aid and contribute to the work of God. That's the first thing that the tithe trust does. The second thing does, it helps us to put God first. That's what it communicates. That in doing so, we are saying, God, you are number one in my life. And that's why in our family, we have always put it at the top of our budget line. It's something we look at least once a month, sometimes twice a month. We pull out our budget, we look at it right there at the top. It's our tithe. And it communicates something. It says, God, you're number one. And thirdly, it helps us to honor God with the rest. Because when you do, we talked about this last week, that when you begin to give in a significant way, whether it's a tithe or if you're going to start at 5% or wherever it's going to be, you know that this is going to change your budget. So there's some sacrifices that have to be made. And again, that's why we push Financial Peace University. It's a great place to be able to learn. You can do it. You really can do it. And take Financial Peace and you'll find out that it's something you can do. But it causes you to start to honor God with everything that you have left over. There's something about paying that tithe that causes me to start paying very close attention to the rest of my budget. And then fourthly, this is the biggest thing, it builds my faith. Because I have learned time and again that God is always faithful to what He says. And when He says, you go ahead and do what I'm leading you to do, I will provide for your needs, I will take care of you, He always does. And we are obedient to God, especially when it's hard, it builds our faith. And like I said earlier, that tends to be harder with the more that we get. It's interesting. I was listening to a sermon by a guy, I like to listen to the podcast of a guy named Aaron Brockett down in Indianapolis. If you like to listen to sermons, he might be someone you want to find on iTunes. It's Traders Point Christian Church. He was talking about the subject of giving, and he said there was a guy that came up to him after a service one time, and it was a friend of his, a guy that had been in the church for a while. And he said, Aaron, I want you to pray for me because I'm really struggling with our tithe. He says, it was easy years ago. Back when we were making $40,000 a year, we never even thought about it. We just did. We just tithed all the time. And then when my income increased, I switched jobs, and I started doing really well. We were making $100,000 a year. He said, we still did it. Now, it was a little more painful. It was more money, but we still did it. He said, right now, we're making so much money. He said, when I'm writing that check out, it's really hard. We're really struggling with this. Would you pray for me? And so Aaron said, yeah, I'll do that. In fact, let me pray for you right now. So he put his arm on his shoulder, and he said, dear God, I just pray for my friend here. I pray that you would reduce his income back to the place where he's willing to trust you again. And Aaron said, I've never been interrupted right in the middle of a prayer before, but he stopped me right there. He says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And Aaron said, yeah, that is what you're talking about, isn't that what you're talking about? And so are you willing to trust God in being generous? So first of all, we receive a trust from God. All that we have actually belongs to God, and we're responsible to Him with what we do with this. Secondly, it takes trust in God to be faithful in giving. But thirdly, here's another concept that Paul helps us to understand, and that is when we give, when we are generous, we build a trust with God. Now, what do I mean by that? You may want to write in your notes something like a trust fund in heaven, because that's what the Bible teaches. Now, he implies it here in the latter portion of chapter 9, but I want us to see where he specifically says this. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. We're just projecting it here. So 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. And look what he says. He says, instruct those who are rich in the present age. Now, remember, whenever we read these we think that's not for me, that's for somebody else. No, this is us. Because if you make anywhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 a year, you are in the top 1% of the population of the world. So this is us we're talking about here. So instruct those, and then we consider everybody who's ever lived, the people that he was writing to or writing about when he said instruct those who are rich in this present age, they would trade places with us in a heartbeat with what we have today. We are far more wealthy than the people that he was talking about here. So this is us. We tend not to think of it that way because we look around and we see what everybody else has, and we always move the chains You know, once you get more, you start thinking, no, rich is over here. I used to think people that had trampolines were rich when I was a kid. And so when we start getting things, then we start thinking what's somebody else that is rich. And so, but no, that's us. So what are we supposed to be instructed? Not to be arrogant. That is, never think that this is because of our own doing that we have received these blessings. Yes, you have to work hard, and yes, you're responsible for what you've been given. And yes, you have to use your energy right, but Moses had reminded the children of Israel, be careful when you go into God's place in this promised land, that when he starts blessing you, you don't start thinking that it's by my own hand that I have received these blessings. Even our ability to be able to create wealth, our ability to work, it all comes from God. So let's not be arrogant about it. Let's be grateful for it. He says, and teach them not to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth. And boy, in America, that is our temptation, isn't it? And the more you have, the more you tend to trust in your wealth. He says, but instead, you put your trust in God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. He wants us to enjoy what we have. And then he goes on and he says, instruct them to do what is good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, willing to share. Now, if we're generous and willing to share, what happens? Look what he says. Storing up for themselves a good reserve for the age to come, so that they may take hold of life that is real. Now, he's not saying that you can earn your salvation by doing this. That's not the taking hold of life. It's the grabbing a hold of the real life. You're not living for the material goods of this world, but instead you're sending it on ahead. And many people have said, you can't take it with you. I did a whole series 2 years ago, a 3-week series entitled, You Can Take It With You. Now, you have to make some transfers here, but look what Jesus said. This is where Paul got it from. Jesus said, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. How do you do that? I had a friend that was going to Myanmar, Burma, as a missionary. And kind of as a lay missionary because they're very regulatory. I mean, it's a closed country. They're starting to open up a little bit, but didn't allow any gospel at all there. Very careful about foreigners coming in and had huge money regulations. In fact, it's very difficult to get money into the country. And so he was working this job, making pretty good money at his job, setting aside everything he possibly could into this bank account and slowly wiring money to another country where he was able to transfer it into a different kind of currency. And then from there, it went to another country, transferred into another kind of currency, till he finally was able to get it into Burma. So he had to go through these different steps to finally get into Burma. And then when he quit his job and went as a lay missionary for 3 years into Burma, he had this account of money set aside for him in a financial institution that he was able to use for his ministry. Now, in the same way, this is what God says we can do. He says, when you die, you can't put your money in your casket and take it with you that way, and you're going to leave everything that you've got here left behind. It's all going to be left here. But by giving it away with the right attitude, by giving it away, we are storing up for ourselves treasures in heaven, in a currency that's far better than the American dollar, treasures in heaven that we will not simply utilize for 30 years of retirement, but for all eternity. That's what being generous does. It sets aside these rewards in heaven. That's what Jesus was talking about. I love the story that John Ortberg told about his grandma teaching him how to play Monopoly. And he said that she was very good at it, and she was ruthless. She said, I was her grandchild, and she loved me dearly, but she never let me win. She never felt sorry for me. And he said, I struggle with Monopoly because I had a hard time. I loved having that play money, and I just couldn't give it up to buy things with it. I wanted to hang on to it. And so she would just buy up all the properties and build houses and hotels and just beat me. And never had any mercy. He said, we played for 2-3 months, and I never came close to winning. But then he had a buddy that lived down the street from him, and all summer long they played Monopoly, and he started to learn the game. That you actually have to buy properties and build houses and hotels, and by spending your money, you start making money by getting it from the person that you're playing with. And he says, I learned how to play, and I got really good at it, and I couldn't wait to play my grandma. The first time I played my grandma after that summer playing Monopoly, I just blew her off the board. He said, in fact, I got to the place where I realized that I was winning. She was going to lose to me. And this is my grandma. She raised my mom. She was so good to me. She helped raise me. Every Christmas and birthday, she was generous to me. And now I'm sitting here taking all of her money and beating her. And he said, I never felt so excited I got up and did this little dance and ran around the room. And then she said, my grandma said, I got one more lesson to teach you about Monopoly. He said, what? She said, it all goes back in the box. He said, I didn't want it to go back in the box. I wanted to frame it. But she closed up the board, took all the money, and put it in the box, folded it up, and put it all away. She said, it all goes back in the box. This game was here before you came, and it'll be here long after you're gone. And that's how it is with life. Well, there's a different game that we used to play with our kids as a family when they were young. I don't even think you can get the game anymore. It's a game called Generosity. It was based on the game of life. And in this game, besides all the things that you can do with life where you receive an income and you have to buy and you have these expenses and you have kids and all this stuff, periodically throughout the board, you'd come across an opportunity to be able to give towards some kind of a significant charitable project. And then you would always have to draw a card. You'd have this opportunity to be able to give. You'd have to draw a card that determined what your attitude was. And if your attitude was right, your money would go in this little packet that was called the Heavenly Treasure Chest. So when the game was over, you had that heavenly treasure chest. The game's going to be over. It's going to be over someday. And what we're playing today, it's all going to wind up going back in the box someday. The question is how are we actually playing? You understand all that you have as being a trust from God. Are you willing to trust in God with your generosity? And in doing so, are you setting aside this trust with God?